Hello, everyone. My name is Veronica Carlin, and I am a member of the Orfeo Music Festival team administering today's webinar. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this session in the new Orfeo Music Festival Spring 2022 webinar series devoted to classical music performance. I believe we have a full and exciting program planned for today. And I would now like to introduce Larissa Jackson, longtime music director of the Orfeo Music Festival, who has led the planning and development of the festival as well as our webinar program today. Larissa will manage our program and will be available to answer any questions during and after this webinar. Larissa?
Hi, everyone. Hi, and welcome. Welcome. And to today's webinar, I would like to say a few words about the festival. Orfeo Music Festival is an international classic music event widely known for its artistic excellence. The festival takes place in Europe each summer, and from the time of its founding in 2003, the festival's mission is to celebrate and promote artistic excellence with classical music performances of the highest caliber, and to offer superior education to the new generation of musicians with the world-class artists, to nurture creativity and to build lasting human and artistic bonds.
Great, and I would like to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel where we will be posting the webinar series. And of course, please share along these recordings with anyone who might be interested.
This spring 2022, we are opening a new webinar series, Music is Our World, which is a 3-year initiative by the Orfeo Music Festival, exploring the role of music in our lives in different ways, but concentrating on the art of musical performance, which lays at the corner of musical experience. And now we're ready to start. And I would like to introduce 3 distinguished guests today who will be participating in a panel on great repertoire choices. And it is Stephen Key, oboist from United States, who teaches at Shenandoah Conservatory. Jessica Sherer, flutist from United States, who teaches at Valdosta State University in Georgia. And Maria Razumovskaya, pianist from United Kingdom, who teaches at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. Welcome, everyone. And over to you.
I guess I could give it a whirl. I thought it would be nice to have this kind of a discussion because I think a lot of musicians are in a period of change right now, at least because of the pandemic. And as we're kind of gradually coming out of that, I think it forced us all to kind of look at what we do, why we do it, and look at that under a new lens. I know for me, just before this happened, I'd kind of gotten in a rut that I'd never experienced before. Just, you take a million auditions, you're playing the same music and repertoire over and over. And while that's part of what we do as I think classical musicians, it can lead to a lot of burnout. And I'd started kind of a brief journey on kind of looking at new things and looking up music I hadn't heard before. And then the pandemic hit, right? And then here in the United States, we had the George Floyd situation and all the protests that occurred after that. So a lot of the musical institutions here in the United States started taking a really good look at ourselves and looking at ways that we can be better. And many DEI initiatives were started, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as a Native American person and a queer person, it was important to me to be a part of this. And so that forced me to then start looking at music through the lens of race and gender. And I suddenly started discovering all these new pieces of music I had never heard of before, many of which I actually really, really loved, and started increasing my repertoire choices as a result of that. So that's kind of where my impetus is for wanting to look at this, is just not allowing ourselves to get stuck in playing the same sonata every single time we perform, playing the same concerto every single time we perform, and finding ways to diversify our repertoire. That's my starting point. I'd love to hear what the rest of you also want to talk about.
I've been looking a lot more into that as well. Also as a woman and a queer person, wanting to make sure that we have representation. That's something I've done for a long time. I've tried every time I've programmed a recital, I always try to include works by female composers. And so that's kind of always been in my mind, but I've definitely been looking for more and newer repertoire over the past couple of years over the course of the pandemic. And especially making sure to increase representation in my own programming and also in helping my students program their pieces. And they've introduced me to quite a bit of new repertoire, which has also been really cool. They've sort of found pieces and said, hey, I heard this at this place, can I do it? And I've absolutely, and so that's been a fun kind of balance, making sure that while they're in college that they're learning all the standard pieces and covering their bases, but also starting to think about, well, what does that even mean to learn the standard pieces? What are the standard pieces? We've always had a repertoire, but we've also always continually added to it. And we have such a rich history going back, several hundred years that we don't want to give up those pieces, and we shouldn't give up those pieces, but that doesn't mean that we favor them over newer pieces just because they're familiar. And it's obviously it's easier to teach pieces that I studied in school and know really well. And so trying to kind of open up my own mind and shelf and pulling in new pieces for my students as well has been a really cool kind of discovery process.
I think as pianists, we've got an absolutely huge repertoire, and the balance of how you go about that can be very tricky, actually, because what I find with students is we can quite easily actually forget that what seems to us old music, like for example, Beethoven sonatas, I find sometimes colleagues say, oh, this is really, old music, we need to move on from this. Actually, most students, it's still new music for them. Mm-hmm. So it's trying to find that balance where you see it new with new eyes for yourself by seeing that Beethoven in conjunction with all these other pieces that are being discovered. So you use the new repertoire to make your own experience of the older repertoire fresher as well. And I feel a little bit bad about, saying to students, oh no, I've heard this piece millions and millions of times, let's not do it. Because I keep having to remind myself, they haven't heard it millions of times. They haven't formed that journey yet with that piece. And it might be a big reference point for one generation, but it's as new as the new pieces for that other generation. But what has changed, I think, over the last few years is the responsibility that we have more closely for us in opening up the narratives about the old pieces. I think what's really empowering about this movement of EDI is that we are forced to reconsider our own biases towards repertoire and to understand why we've been making those choices, and not sort of sleepwalk into those choices, but actually explore, like, what is the relevance of it today? What was the relevance of it before? And that dynamic, I think, really opens up lots of conversations between colleagues, to sort of think, well, why have I been playing that Beethoven sonata? What was its position for my professor or the professor of my professor, and how has that changed? Actually, where do we want that to go? Do we want it to sort of stay within that sort of same lineage, or is it time to sort of say, well, let's look at it in conjunction with this piece and let it take a new journey? So I think with repertoire, this increased awareness of how much we don't know about what's been around has really pushed us to think a bit more about what narratives we have been sort of just accepting without challenging. And I think it's a brilliant time to be actually a musician now, because of that kind of rethinking of things that's going on, that we don't feel we have to perpetuate something, that there's some kind of fresh start there.
Yeah, and access, I think, is so much easier now. I mean, we all have the internet, and I mean that's a big resource for me. Certainly, there's a publisher and music distributor in the United States, Trevco, which mostly deals with double reed music, but they actually have a search engine where you can just put in what type of instruments you want to have and whatever chamber music, and then all of their music pops up, and they do a really good job of just finding stuff. They have a whole section of music only by women, actually. And so if that is something that one is wanting to look for, they can find it there. I think, when we're choosing our recital selections and when we're choosing our performing selections, it's really important to love the music you're playing, right? And we're all in some professorial roles, so it's helping the student find music they really resonate with, because they're gonna play it better, right? They're gonna be a better performer if they're playing music that they love. And I love that you bring up narratives, because I think so much of what we do is storytelling through our instruments, right? And so understanding those narratives behind them and having students relate to those narratives in some way helps to make the music come out, certainly. And I mean, who wants to see an unimpassioned performance? Yeah.
It makes me think a lot about what we present to our students too in terms of historical context. I don't know about for your instruments, but for in flute repertoire, we have a really rich selection of music in our canon, but it's certainly more limited than the piano repertoire. And so when we study the pieces, we always learn something about the historical context, and usually it has to do with stylistic elements and compositional styles and things like that. Sometimes with certain pieces, there's some kind of like broader world history elements that come in, and especially when there's an important political period happening at the same time, some music that was written, in rebellion or in protest or something like that. And that's always nice to learn about, but then also kind of changing how we look at the historical context. So of course we need to look at stylistic trends compositionally, but then also pulling in a little bit more context in terms of just humanity during whichever time period a piece comes from, and how it relates and how we've grown from it, and making sure that we're always relating back to where a piece came from. I think is also really important. I tend to really enjoy programming chronological recitals. I don't always do it that way, but sometimes I find that it's really interesting to take a piece from each major period and kind of line them up and look at how they relate to each other. So that's also a really interesting thing to keep looking back on and keep reassessing over and over as we mix newer repertoire with older repertoire.
I actually have a question for you, Tuvin. Just because the piano repertoire is so rich, we have this idea that you won't be able to play all of it. And I mean, there's no way you can play all the piano repertoire. So you end up with people sort of picking and choosing and gravitating to certain bits of styles. If the music we're discovering is new, how would you recommend people go about it? Do you recommend like trying to put a narrative into something that you already have, or treat it on its own terms? So if you discover a composer who sounds a bit like a particular other composer, would you start to try and bring that composer in the same recital with another one, or keep them separate? I'm thinking, for example, in terms of string music, there's been a huge resurgence, for example, in the works of Chevalier de Saint-Georges, and how he's been called the Black Mozart. And I mean, would you put those two together, or would you keep them separate just to emphasize their individuality? Or do you actually need the two together to understand how their stylistic individuality is actually completely creatively, following different trajectories? They're in their own right very different people, and that's a question I haven't actually resolved for myself. So I'd be interested to know what you think. Similarly, here in the UK, there's a huge interest in the works of Florence Price, and again, how do you program that kind of music? Do you put it alongside the composers she should have been heard alongside, sort of to prove a point that she is as good as these people, they're in the same decade, why haven't we heard her? Or do you program her in her own right, as if she can stand along without that apologetic narrative, without having to reposition her back in her time? Can she be treated as an icon that just stands independently of time? And can she be programmed, I don't know, with Haydn creation or something like this? Does she have to be with her own time? Or is that a passing phase?
I love your question, and what I like about it is that I don't think that there is a specific answer. And the thing that I see as the common narrative here, though, is that regardless, one is being thoughtful about why they're programming what they're programming. And that, I think, is what's at the core of your question, is that there is some thought put into it. It's not just cause, right? Because either way has great points to it. Having an underrepresented composer be performed on their own, showing their own way, also doing a compare contrast. I think both of those have validity. They're both valid, yeah, there's reasons for both. So I think that's great.
Do you think the audiences would differ for them though? Like, do you think that one would require maybe an audience who's a bit hesitant about music they haven't heard outside their comfort zone would prefer one type of programming? And do you think maybe, or do you think it doesn't matter, that the public is so hungry for new stuff anyway that they don't mind if they get lost? I'm interested, curious actually, what's happening in the US.
Depends on the age of your board and your donors. No, I'm kidding.
Yes, that's what's happening in the US. But you make an important point. I actually think it is important right now to take advantage of that hunger that you mentioned. That's of course not always the case, but there is everything sort of broken open in the last few years and really made room for newness in a way that the classical music world hasn't really welcomed in quite some time. So it's definitely important to take advantage of that. But when I'm thinking about your question, which is a really important one, and it's a huge responsibility to think about, to be thoughtful about that programming. But there are so many different ways to look at it. And I don't think, like Stephen, I don't think there's one answer. But you've started with a really important question. And then I think there are a lot of follow-up questions. So for example, if you're programming an orchestra season, do you have, is each concert thematic? Do you have a concert that is entirely from one period where you're doing comparing and contrasting anyway, and there's room to include maybe a lesser known composer? Or are you doing sort of, like a graduate school recital type program where you need to have representation from each period? And then why not pull in someone new for one or two of the periods? For that representation, you still have the stylistic representation that you're looking for. And so why not sort of start to standardize those pieces by using them in that way? But I think it really just depends on the context of the program overall. I mean, when I program the chronological programs that I was mentioning, I often will pull in a couple of composers that people don't know. And then there's usually, I usually play something by Debussy or, a really well-known composer as well. So I think it really just depends on the context. And then, we sort of take on the responsibility of making it work, just like we always have to make programming work and have something that's diverse and yet accessible.
The other thing, I don't know whether this has you teach, so you come across these issues, I think. Because I certainly do. Students come with their sort of Spotify playlists. I listened to this and all of this came up. I'm always very frustrated that it comes up as more of the same. That actually there's something wrong with that algorithm, in my opinion. It thinks like if you listen to one piece, which is I don't know, like let's say for the sake of argument, it's a very syncopated piece with a march in the middle. It will come up with more syncopated pieces with a march in the middle. It won't actually sort of give me any breadth. So it will try and match up to a similar kind of sound. And I'm wondering whether that's actually quite damaging in some ways, in that it sort of decides for you, and then it blocks off your ability to make that choice for yourself.
Well, it's certainly not a teaching algorithm.
Y'all are so right. I mean, Jessica, you keep talking about like our responsibility it really is true. I think at the pedagogical level, so much of this is us. Like we are the ones who decide, wittingly or not, for the next generation what classical music is, which is kind of scary if you think about it, but also really great, so I also love that you mentioned taking advantage of this time, because I look at these periods and I feel like they're often short windows, and people tend to kind of go back to sleep after a couple years, right? And so we are at this kind of brief moment where I think we can push the needle a bit. And open audiences to a greater variety of music. I mean, I have long been a fan of 20th and now 21st century music. And I'm noticing, like, when I talk to other millennials, I'm barely a millennial, but I am a millennial. I just turned 40 last summer. I'm an elder millennial, as they call it. But I notice when I talk to other people my age and younger who enjoy classical music, so-called classical music, tend to leave and maybe go to a concert every now and then. They actually love modernism. Like generally speaking, they're also ready to go see a Haydn quartet every now and then, that kind of thing. But when I introduce them to modernism, they often are very cool with it. I mean, and so I don't think that we need to be afraid of pushing audiences at times, especially with the upcoming generation.
Yeah,
Um,
I completely agree. We're in an important moment to sort of have this opportunity to start canonizing newer repertoire. And I also agree that audiences are actually very open to new repertoire. And that I think we've now kind of had enough distance from the sort of center of the common practice period and kind of pushed past that like mid 20th century avant-garde period to the point where the music that's being written now and in the last 20, 50, 100 years does have a little bit more accessibility to modern audiences who are not musicians. And we now have kind of more repertoire on the other side of that, and that I think we're able to mix and match a little bit more. And audiences tend to be pretty open, to newer repertoire, especially now that we have the ability to write and print program notes for everything we're doing, and we have it's become more common practice to speak about music on stage and kind of give audiences something to hold on to as they're listening. That seems to be really effective, and we have so much great repertoire that's coming out now that has things to hold on to, and as long as we point that out, we really have a great opportunity right now to pull more repertoire into the canon.
Getting back a little bit to what Maria was saying, with also looking at certain old pieces. I mean, I definitely also agree that like some of the older works they've stood the test of time for a reason. I mean, and I have one that I always come back to, the Mozart Quartet, right? It's pretty famous, and I love that piece. I love playing it. And I've probably done it 10, 20 times at this point in my life. And every time I do it, I come back to it with like a new, fresh sense of something about it. And I find something new in it that I didn't think of before. Or, God, Tombo, how many times has that been performed, right? And as an oboist, And I have a recording of me playing it from not even that long ago. It was like 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And I'm currently teaching students those excerpts, and I'm now looking back at the recording that I was pretty proud of and still am, but I think of it totally differently now. And that was only 5 years ago. And so there is room to grow and adapt even old classics that we love, and they're classics that we love for a reason. And I think keeping those pillars there, I think that is crucial. I mean, I always say that our job as classical musicians is kind of twofold. We have to be historical preservationists and performers at the same time. And marrying those two things is one of the ways that we have great performances.
I think it's tough talking about everything in a canon, though. I think we're in this situation now where we've had this dissatisfaction of, I guess, almost that sleepwalking into it, doing the same thing over and over again, and quite rightly, we've had to rethink our attitude to what we're doing and our relationship to it. It makes me nervous to think about canonizing new composers, because for me that seems to be exactly what we're trying to break out from. And the sense that we are making these choices, inevitably we're hoping that people will fall in love with these new composers, these new ideas, and we are hoping that people will gravitate towards them, and cumulatively more and more of these ideas will start spreading, right? You don't want to sort of do one performance of one piece and then that's it, it's lost, right? We're sort of hoping that one new piece is going to inspire lots and lots of other people to come and engage exactly with that piece, to start on their own journey. And I think that's where what we do as professional musicians really has a really strong implication in terms of pedagogy, because as you said, with the historical preservation, if you're working in a conservatoire, what is it that you are conserving? And that's a big question that I keep asking myself. What are we conserving? Are we conserving just purely technique, in which case we have certain bits of repertoire that narrate a change in technique. So I mean, we can't get rid of those. That they've evolved in that particular way. So as a pianist, for example, Chopin etudes, they re-established the boundaries of technique. There's a reason why we ask pianists to go through the cycle of playing those. I'm sure with your instruments, you've also got sort of things that have ignited technique. Are we preserving, like as you said, are we preserving sort of core bits of representative repertoire? In which case, that might be time, to widen that and say, right, why have we sort of stopped preserving after, I don't know, Rite of Spring or whatever? What has stopped us preserving that other section that's closer to our lifetimes? But likely, are we preserving also this sense of pedagogical lineage that we have, for example, within our modern history, ideas of music? And that is where it becomes more problematic, isn't it? Because how far back do we go? How many generations are we preserving? Or do we have to purposefully keep trying to break those barriers up? So the repertoire choice we make as professionals, we're hoping that, we can probably play a piece once, get satisfied, but move on to something else. But that's not enough for a student, right? Because they need exposure to that piece over a much more period of time. So I mean, to fall in love with a piece of music as a student, you need to hear it quite a lot. And you probably need to hear it in quite a lot of different interpretations so that you can start to understand how to form your own dialogue with it. I'm conscious that, for example, I can come to a piece and I know that I've heard, I don't know, X number of recordings of it and X number of live recitals of it. And that's helped me form my own language when I open the score myself to grapple with it and to ask myself those difficult questions. What do I want to do with it? As a professional, I know that I can listen to a new music or open a new music score, and actually I have reference points that then spark off these similar kinds of questions for me. So I might take a piano piece by a composer who's a contemporary of someone like Beethoven, because I know about what Beethoven's sort of gestures and language is. I can have this dialogue. Why aren't you Beethoven? I've got a starting point. I don't necessarily need to hear 20 recordings of this new piece. I could make my own way through it. But a student can't, right? That's why they're in a conservatoire. They need somebody or something to have formed those questions for them in a more obvious way. They almost need, like you said, that sense of canon. Whereas we can be more about, let's break up the canon. Pedagogy relies on a safety blanket. It relies on, a safe environment to experiment. So it needs almost like, here are some opinions, and these opinions stand the test of time. So you get this interesting sort of tension. You need comfort to know that you're going from the right direction as you're getting up on your feet. But then once you're more or less on your feet, you need to get rid of that comfort pretty quickly, right? Otherwise you become stale and just, you're just zombie or walking through the same, street all the time. So it's a strange dynamic, and I'm wondering how that is going to play out and how it's going to work in the lives of people who are very committed pedagogues, but also performers at the same time, the ones with the kind of that split, and whether it's going to be different for people who are purely pedagogues and purely performers. Is that spectrum going to have different sort of leanings?
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point. You make several great points, and I think I completely agree with you that we don't want to sort of widen the net and then limit it again, sort of in the same scope. And that you're right, it's a difficult balance to strike because as I'm sort of thinking about, I keep coming back to this idea of responsibility as the performers and teachers of this music. We sort of have the ability to incorporate or disincorporate various pieces and composers and styles. And from a pedagogical standpoint, canonization to me is important to do right now, because I don't, I do want to keep teaching the same Mozart and Bach and Reinecke and all of our standard pieces. I do want to keep teaching those. And I also want my students, just as they are familiar with those, I want them to become more familiar with pieces by Valerie Coleman and Jennifer Higdon. and that's not going to happen without that canonization. It's, they need to see it programmed frequently, the same pieces programmed frequently from different people to sort of say, okay, this is what we're doing, this is what we as flutists do. And there's this like sort of club mentality, like I'm one of the people who can play these pieces, I'm in the club of people who have this repertoire. And I think that's really important pedagogically and also as a performer, because we're doing the same thing with our audiences. We're the ones who are bringing in the non-musicians to sort of understand a new generation and style of music. And so the same, as you mentioned, the repetition is important. The repetition of hearing and seeing and familiarizing, that's just how we work as human people. And so I do think that's important. And also, how do we do that without then limiting what we, where do we stop? Because we don't want to sort of decide, okay, yes, we're going to play the music of Valerie Coleman and Jennifer Higdon, but then that's it, because we want to keep expanding and keep pulling in new repertoire. But I think that sort of becoming standard sort of happens on its own when a person hears a few performances of a specific piece and it's particularly compelling, then they want to play it, and then the next person wants to play it, and the next person wants to play it, and that's sort of how that happens. So it's up to us to sort of start to expose those pieces and then back up and see what happens with them, especially if we're exposing our students, then their friends are going to hear it and they're going to play it. And, there's a certain element of that sort of happens naturally, as long as we give those pieces the opportunity and then step back a little bit.
There's certainly an element of like organicness that we don't have that much control over, I think, is kind of part of what's there. Yeah. But the part we do is the music we choose, right? Yeah. And that we show our students. I love it. I keep thinking about like being a wind player. Canonization is a different story for us, right? Because like I remember there's a pretty famous oboist in the United States I'm friends with, and she recently did kind of a general poll of oboists of like, what do you consider to be the main pieces? And it was like 30 pieces long. You say that to a pianist, they're like, 30 by which composer? Right? And which part of their life? Right? And so we're honestly in a specific place where we're still adding to the canon. We have room to grow in wind literature, and so there's certainly lots of space for it. I'm a big proponent of arranging as well. Like during this process, I've been hearing about Lily Boulanger, of course, for years, right? But I had never actually sat down and listened to anything by her. So I finally did, and I just completely fell in love. And then you find out about the tragic backstory, and it's like, oh my God, this is the whole thing, right? And I love her song cycle, the Claire dans le ciel. My pronunciation is probably awful. My French is very, very bad. But and so I started playing it on the oboe, and it's like the perfect range. Yes, we lose the words, but I think as long as the performer understands what's happening, it can be a very effective thing. I have a student now, because she enjoyed my performance of it. She's now doing selections as well on her recital, and there's a lot of that happening. I think the original setup for me was. Several years ago, actually, that same Tombo concert, our conductor, Alejandro Valdez Hernandez, asked me to do some arranging. And the idea was there's this Radiohead piece, because this was a World War I concert, that was recorded with voiceover from, I guess, the last surviving World War I soldier from, I think, Great Britain. And but they wanted to have like a version for strings and tenor. So I wrote one, and I mean, the idea was that he said, how singer-songwriters will do covers of like famous pieces. Why can't like chamber orchestras do the same thing? I mean, there are whole like copyright things that one has to deal with, of course, as well. But that's basically what we did. We did a cover of this Radiohead piece, or Radiohead song, written for string orchestra and tenor, and it was really quite effective. And that is something I'm really enjoying seeing in like the younger generation of students. Now, Shenandoah is a very specific kind of conservatory. Like I only have like one student who's interested in maybe doing orchestra stuff. Most of them are interested in education or professorial roles or like chamber music, that kind of thing. And a lot of the younger generation is not as interested in the kind of careers that were the case 30 years ago. They're interested in having a multifaceted chamber music, teaching, soloing, gigging kind of career. I see that a lot now. I'm curious what y'all's experiences are at the collegiate level as well.
Yeah, same for me. I think I have one student who wants to be a college professor specifically, but most of them are just like pretty open, and they want to innovate, and they want to change things, and they want to kind of do their own thing and do a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And that idea has me really re-examining even what I teach outside of solo repertoire. I've changed over to I've started incorporating like film score excerpts into our orchestral excerpt repertoire, because I a lot of our, especially in Atlanta, where we have a big film industry, and in like Nashville, there's a lot of film score opportunities for musicians too, who are kind of doing a lot of things. And I always tell this funny story. One of my orchestras did a concert of Disney Pixar music, and it was with a film behind it, and so it was on this click track, and I got the music just maybe a day ahead, and I was traveling the whole time, so I didn't really have time to look at it ahead of the first rehearsal. And of course, those film score concerts are hundreds of pages long, and it's all difficult, and none of it's familiar. Like when when I was doing a lot of freelancing, I literally played a new concert every week, and most of the time a lot of that music is familiar, but with these film score things, they're new, and I didn't know any of it. And I also haven't seen a lot of Pixar movies, so it wasn't even familiar to me. And I had like maybe a half hour to look at it in the hotel before the first rehearsal. And so I'm kind of like flipping through and looking for these solos, and looking for, where there's like a lot of ink on the page, and what do I have to learn really fast. And I see in Ratatouille, I see this flute solo, and I look at it, and I look at the metronome marking, and I was like, oh God, this is going to be this is what I have to really work on. So I was like, okay, I've got 10 minutes to learn this solo, and it was like 8 bars, and I drilled it, and I had it, and it was great. And we went into rehearsal, and we played it. It went really well. It was beautiful. And then, I get to this like big multi-measure rest afterwards, and I'm like, oh, thank goodness that's over. That went great. Turn the page, keep playing, and nobody else plays. And the solo went on for another page and a half.
Oh my God.
I didn't see it coming, and I'm like sight reading this impossible thing. And we get to the end of the rehearsal, and we had like a 4-hour break before the next rehearsal, and I was like, okay, I have time, I'm gonna just drill it and learn it. And then they said, you know what, this music's really hard, we're gonna add another 2.5-hour rehearsal in the middle. So I lost that time too, so I just kind of had to wing it. And at the end of that rehearsal, I just said, listen, there is no reason that I shouldn't have known this solo coming into this rehearsal. This is now becoming standard for people to play these film scores, and why didn't I know that there was this giant solo in Walrat from Ratatouille? That's something you should know. And so, right now there is no book for film score excerpts like there are for other orchestral excerpts. We have one book that has some solos from Harry Potter, and that's it. And so that's something that I've been really just like pulling solos from film scores for myself, and teaching my students alongside the regular repertoire, because it's coming up all the time. I don't know if that's your experience, Stephen, as an orchestral player, but I play with about 8 different orchestras regularly, and I've played at least one film music concert with all of them in the last 3 years. They rotate in and out. Every orchestra does at least one of those pretty much every year in my experience. So anyway, it's just, thinking about how we're sort of training our students for potential future work as professional musicians. We've got some rethinking to do there as well, for sure.
Yeah, we're certainly in the middle of major shifts and changes in our career. Like that's yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. So oh my gosh, now I'm trying to think, how do we get back to picking great rep? Oh wow.
Well, yeah, I know that's not sort of solo rep, but that's what I'm thinking. That's where my mind is in terms of teaching rep, is like, making sure that we teach solo rep, but we also teach orchestra rep as we're choosing what to teach our students, for sure.
Do y'all want to do the dring this summer?
We've actually done that at Orfeo before. I love that piece. It's one of my favorites. It's such a beautiful piece and
He
underplayed.
apparently wrote a lot for film too, so that's why I was kind of like thinking of all that together.
Yeah, so Stephen's referring to Madeline Dring's trio for flute, oboe, and piano. It's a beautiful piece.
I'm also thinking in terms of repertoire, and when you've got a context, maybe some conservatoires have more leaning towards academics, some have less leaning, and it sometimes depends on which course exactly your student is on. So I know in the UK students can get on with a couple of institutions where they hardly have to teach any academics, but that's becoming less and less of a possibility now. I think students might sort of resist having to deal with the academics of the repertoire that they're playing, but they're now being more mainstream lined into the course itself. And I don't know how you're finding it in America, but this sense of there's a keenness to play certain repertoire, but then an awareness that it's difficult socially to justify it because of sort of media criticism. And whether conservatoires need to do more to be felt like it's a safe place to discuss issues about why certain repertoire might be contentious, and this idea of, are you allowed to play it? Are you allowed to speak about it? Or should you sort of walk sideways? And I mean, the example of that for years has been Wagner's music, for example. Like we know about Wagner's ideology, and therefore, you know, we've sort of kept quiet that, okay, we still program his music, but he wasn't a very nice person. But now that sense is actually expanding into more and more areas of classical music, and we're getting to the sort of the stage where even sort of what used to be not too long before standard composer like Handel raises all sorts of questions, especially in the UK with his links to what he did in the past and what companies he had shares in. And suddenly students go blank, you know, and you get this sort of, am I allowed to play Handel? And how do you manage that? Because I think shutting down culture is the most damaging thing you can do. But somewhere needs to be a safe space to have a conversation and a student to feel they can ask a question naively, perhaps, and not be judged for it, rather than having that silence come over them. They've asked the wrong thing or they've said slightly the wrong thing. Because I think as we have more experience in the sort of dealing with how stuff fits together, we make our own choices how to navigate that language. But students coming up from school, they will ask naive questions, won't they? And it's how to bring together the social aspects of us rethinking our history and rethinking of our position of what we do going forward, with the sense of actually we don't know the answers ourselves as professionals to a lot of these questions that we're asking, and how we give that open space, how we promote that dialogue, you know, without sort of looking at someone and shutting them down for asking something naive, or, you know, it might not be from, okay, it could be from bad intentions, but I think that's the minority of cases. In most cases, it's a naive question, or one which they really need an example of how to start that dialogue, and how to do that with repertoire. Because I mean, what we've gone through is a huge shift, like you've both said. Yeah, this is really unprecedented. I mean, I hate that word, but I think it is an unprecedented part of history that we're living through at the moment. In terms of the change of our thinking, I don't think it's you know, we've had quite a stable way of seeing stuff for so long, and now it's happening all so quickly. And like you've already mentioned as well, with social media, it's even probably even faster, and our words travel faster than they've ever done in so many generations. So something that used to have a local context suddenly has to have a global context. And I think as professionals, we haven't yet prepared ourselves for that, and how important our choice of words is, as well as our actions. And how does that sit with our repertoire? You know, how do we stop something becoming attached to a symbol and locking down a conversation? You know, a Beethoven sonata that meant something to several generations ago, that doesn't have to be the symbol that's attached going forward. But should we close off the conversation because it had a particular symbol before? Or do we explain the problematics of that symbol before teaching that sonata to them and sort of let them make their own choice? or you know, what do we do? You know, we look at all these productions, these great productions, with modern eyes, they would be quite hurtful to watch. But with the eyes of that time, they have a completely different meaning. And do we try to reconcile those two worlds, or do we, you know, keep taking new repertoire and try to sort of hide those bits a bit sort of underneath everything else, and you know, just yeah, don't touch that one here, have a look at this instead, and whether that's actually opening up new problems in a couple of years to come. And I think that's also another question that's quite heavy on all our shoulders, isn't it?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's so many. So, that was like about 6 different questions. I do have some thoughts on some of those though. And I am one who does consider themselves like a leftist and all the like social justice warrior things. But like, I've had plenty of students who aren't from that same kind of thought process, and like, I don't think any of them would ever say that I would never allow a question or shut down. Like, if you're a good professor and you like uh, really want relationships to build as part of the way you teach, which I do, then the student is going to know that they're in a safe space to ask you whatever they want to ask. And even with my own personal thought processes, I look at these things as a few things to consider. Like, first of all, change is the only constant. There will always be new music, and some music will gradually fade regardless of our intention or unintention. And then you also look at things like, well, J.K. Rowling, for instance. Like, I have a problem with some of the things that she believes, but the Harry Potter franchise is thousands of people deep, right? It is not only her. And so, you know, can I hold Daniel Radcliffe accountable? Can I hold all of the people behind the camera, all of the writers that also help make everything happen, all the, like, it involves so many people. And if I look at Wagner the same way, things that I'm seeing some production companies do with Wagner is they do have historical context kind of explained in a lot of the program notes. They'll do small changes as well, because, I mean, clearly there are anti-Semitic tropes in it. So one can change some of those tropes, make the characters slightly different, change a few things here or there, but keep kind of an overall. There are many approaches to the way that we can do this. I mean, there's a lot of just blatant misogyny in a lot of opera, right? And some of it can be quite triggering and harmful. And so it gives us an opportunity to look at this and say, well, how can we stage this in a way that isn't hurtful to people in the audience who maybe have experienced something like this? You know, so then we get into questions also of like, how much are we allowed as artists to then change something that is like a pre-written piece of art? Are we allowed to do that? I think there are a lot of people who think that we shouldn't do that. I tend to be one that's just kind of a free-for-all with art. So, I mean, I think honestly, it goes all the way back to my undergraduate training, where my professor there, we have this kind of famous method book, Barrett, and he taught us it in a way where we basically ignore everything that's on the page, and he gave us his own concept of phrasing and dynamics and all this to make it make more sense to a modern ear. So, I mean, even from my early training, I was taught to look at things from a kind of fresh perspective at all times, and to be reevaluating them and changing them as things need to. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot. That was Jessica, do you have any thoughts?
You know, yes. I mean, I'm asking similar questions, really. It's a I feel like my theme of the day is responsibility, right? But because whatever decision we make around that question then teaches our students also kind of at least their starting place, because we all sort of start thinking of things the same as our teachers, and then over the years we form our own opinions. But yeah, it's a big responsibility. You know, our studio itself has always been a really safe space for any questions, any mistakes, any discussion, and anything. And that's really important to me, to have that environment. In terms of public programming, there's not a ton in our solo repertoire that's problematic. And so we don't, I, as a teacher, as a programmer, programming my own recitals, I don't really have to think about that question as much, and I'm always grateful that I'm not the one programming the orchestra concerts and the operas and things like that, because those are the people in the positions that really have to grapple with that question. It's a tough question. I think it's important to know the literature. When we're studying orchestral music in studio, we're not performing that, we're just studying it, and it's important to know the music and the context. And I actually kind of relish the opportunity to teach music, even that does come from a problematic context. But performing it regularly, that's an entirely different question. It's tough. I'm curious, Maria, you sort of asked the question, but I'm curious what your approach has been so far.
Well, I guess always trying to make sure that the students, as you say, feel safe to ask those questions and not to feel they're going to be judged by asking why a particular bit of repertoire has been making the news for particular reasons. So why, I think it's very wrong of us to sort of assume that a student would understand why a particular piece of music has been getting a particular bad press. But also to try and get my students to think that it might get a bad press now, but it's about the integrity in which that piece was used. So perhaps in a different context, it wouldn't have had that same reaction. Also, the sense that sometimes events happen that make us, really jolt, and passions run high, and we make decisions that perhaps we might not stick with later on down the line. So whatever we read about a piece of music and how inappropriate it might be for a particular context today, that might disappear quite quickly. So the sense that history doesn't stand still, and a reception of a piece never stands still. And the sense of attaching a symbol to a particular piece of music, it's important, because creating symbols is how art communicates in many ways. I mean, a symbol unifies a large group of people to see an event, or to see so for example, to see Marriage of Figaro as a symbol of Enlightenment thought, of empowering Susanna, from sort of the underclass upwards above the aristocracy. As an opera, Marriage of Figaro has that symbolism, so that when we talk about it, we all know that we're talking about, in some ways, the beginning of society questioning itself. So in kind of our moment back then. So that symbol is important, that we're all on the same page. We all know what we're using this music for. So without a symbol, we can be quite lost, because how can we communicate unless we know that people understand us? Symbols are also problematic because once you start investing an agenda into a symbol, you block out other options of seeing that piece of music. So you end up, a lot has been done with Beethoven as the mythical Beethoven, and how sometimes we've invested this revolutionary spirit into him, excluding out of him humanism. Just, he was an ordinary person who loved a joke, and we don't talk about that enough. We sort of put Beethoven as this, he was suffering because of his deafness, and he was suffering for humanity, and all these layers of history and symbols that mean we don't just treat him as a person who might have just had a tantrum and being a pretty horrid person to have around for a dinner party, because he'd ruin all your conversations. But you can also see that in his music. But sometimes the symbol becomes so large we're blinded by it, and sometimes we have to start to, in a way, divorce that artwork from the person who created it in a much more provocative way. And I keep sort of saying that you talked about modernism, and the sense of that we've gone past that modernist aesthetic. I guess the modernists were trying very much to sort of say, oh, this is a composer's work and it's got to be performed in a particular way. And this freedom, that we're having now, this after that era of, actually, the composer created it, go away. It's independent of that particular time and that particular composer. It's taking on the life that we as a society now, looking at that music, are giving it. It's alive in a completely different way to its original genesis. And that's great, because we can take that symbol out. We can put our own symbol onto it. And as long as we don't expect that symbol to last the next 100 years, 200 years, I'd be horrified if the symbols we're putting onto music now had any legitimacy 2-3 years down the line. I would be genuinely horrified, because it means as a society we are not evolving. We're stagnating, and we're sort of holding on to positions and entrenching ourselves. I think a creative, liberal, and tolerant society is always going to be looking at repertoire and forming new links with it, and forming new relationships with it, and one hopes positive ones. As you said, we like to play music, we love to share music, we put love into it. We don't try to destroy things with our music making. We try to build up hope and humanity and all these wonderful things. We don't spend hours in the practice room for nothing. I'm going to sit and practice to destroy humanity. No, nobody does that. I mean, that's just complete nuts, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what I try to get my students to really take with them, is that you, for whatever reason, you've latched onto that piece. That piece has, I don't know, spoken to you, whatever. That piece has somehow affected you, whether it's there's a sound colors in it, whether it's that, some people just like technically rattling through it because it makes them feel powerful. Wow, I can do all those octaves on the piano. I feel like a superhero today. That's fine, right? But it's how you then use that to empower other people to firstly find yourself in that piece. What is it about yourself that you found in that piece? What is it you're celebrating about yourself? But what can that give to other people as a sense of hope? So not to use, you should never use art for destructive means, essentially, right? So whatever you bring, whatever history it's had, I don't think you should feel chained to that history if your mission now is to liberate it, and to start a new life for it. I really don't agree with this sort of, this is a bad piece, we're keeping it bad, okay, that's going to be in the bad list. Nothing should be off bounds, because you take ownership, and you said responsibility. I'm going to say my word is integrity. You should have integrity with what you're doing, and as long as you've got integrity and you know that you're using it for that means that brings people together, you can't really go wrong, right? And that should be your safe space, and people should respect
music is
it.
art in time, right? So without the artist performing it, it doesn't exist, right? So there's an inherent self that we're adding to a piece of music whenever we are the ones performing it. So, that is its own life at that moment in time. And I think, if there's a student who doesn't feel comfortable asking questions from a professor or any sort of pedagogue, that pedagogue should probably reanalyze why they're teaching. That is also a discussion we're having these days too, about kind of the power dynamics and all of that, and and something that I've been interested in a long time. But it's a professor should never. Professors should not exist who create a situation where a student doesn't feel that comfortable asking questions, and if they do feel uncomfortable asking questions, then there are a lot of other things I'm also going to be concerned about that particular professor or teacher in some way. Because there's something going on there with the power dynamic that shouldn't be happening. So.
But it's not just professor, it's critic, it's audience member.
Sure, God, yeah.
It's wider than that. It's that I guess we're trying to discover new repertoire because we're trying to show that we are excited by diversity. And I think that's what audiences also, as long as they can feel the integrity of the musicians, they should be excited by that diversity too. And so it's a kind of a two-way thing we're asking, right? Yeah. We bring you diversity, but you respect diversity as well, and you keep that dialogue open. And you never know, somebody might say something that just changes your world, or play something in a way that changes your world. And that's what we're trying to do with repertoire, aren't we? Trying to change people's world.
Yeah.
For the better.
For the better.
No art for destruction. We will be tolerant to art for destruction.
Well, a firework of ideas today. Firework of ideas. And in a way, music is our solution, because music is not unlike words or unlike any other art. The symbols change and the music survives. And it doesn't have to signify this or that. So thank you very much for your contribution. And the new repertoire will never even have a chance if you, the performers, are not bringing it to life. So it is, these are all very essential questions for today's music world, music performance world. So thank you very much, everybody, today. And we're very grateful for your very open and incredible ideas and sharing all the thoughts. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to next webinar and would like to say bye until next time. Veronica.
It's great to meet all of you.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing you this summer.
Great, cool. Yeah, I just wanted to say how honored we are to have had Professors Razumovskaya, Key, and Sherer join our program today, and for sharing the knowledge and art. It was truly such an interesting discussion, so thank you so much for your time. And we hope you will join us for our next sessions, which will be on March 9th, the benefits of playing chamber music, a woodwind quartet masterclass with Florence Padilla from Drake University. And then on March 10th, which is a Thursday from 3 to 9 p.m., we will have a violin masterclass on Ravel and Tisgane and Wieniawski. Excuse my pronunciation. And then on March 12th, which is a Saturday from 1 to 2 p.m., we will have a piano masterclass with Natuski Fukasawa. And yes, we hope you join us for these very exciting webinars coming up, which are all found on our website. And before we conclude, I would just like to introduce those of you who might have missed the new dates for this summer's edition for the Orfeo Music Festival, an international classical music event and a one-of-a-kind opportunity for ambitious classical music student performers to travel to Italy in July to train with world-class faculty performers, participate in their master classes, perform internationally, and gain recognition in concerts, go on trips and musical tours of historical locations, and make new friendships and international network of professional connections. This year, Orfeo Festival will feature the festival program in Vipiteno, Italy from July 4th to July 16th. This event is suitable not only for student and educator performers, but also others with strong interest or professional involvement in the music and arts. You can register for the event through March 15th, which is coming up very soon. So we encourage you to sign up and ask questions if you have any. And we would like to thank our sponsors as well. That include the Orfeo Music Festival Foundation, Mayor Vipiteno Peter Volger, Department of Culture, City Council, and Department of Tourism of Vipiteno, Italy. If anyone here has any questions, we encourage you to reach out to us directly or by visiting our website at www.orfeomusicfestival.com. www.orfeomusicfestival.com. We thank you again for attending today, and we look forward to speaking with you, playing with you all again soon, or seeing you at the festival.